The message came from the edge of known space, carried on frequencies that most species had stopped using centuries ago. It traveled through the cold emptiness between stars, bouncing off relay stations and dead satellites, growing weaker with every light year. By the time it reached Earth, it was little more than static wrapped around a desperate voice. Commander Jake Harris was eating a cold sandwich in his office when the alert came through. He worked at the United Nations Space Command headquarters in Houston, a building that had once tracked simple rockets and now coordinated humanity's small fleet of interstellar ships. Jake was 42 years old, with tired eyes and gray at his temples. He had spent 20 years in the military and thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. The technician who brought him the decoded transmission was shaking. Jake read it 3 times before he believed it. The message was from a species called the Korathi. They were traders and farmers, peaceful people who had never harmed anyone. And they were dying. An empire called the Vectran Dominion had attacked their colony world without warning. The Vectran were conquerors. They moved from system to system, taking what they wanted and destroying what they did not need. The Korathi colony of Sethan Prime had 20 million civilians. The Vectran wanted the planet for its minerals. The people living there were simply in the way. The message included images. Jake saw cities on fire. He saw small, silver-skinned beings running through streets filled with smoke and ash. He saw children crying over the bodies of their parents. He saw a mother holding her dead infant, her face turned toward a sky filled with enemy warships. The Korathi ambassador who sent the message spoke directly to the camera. His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling. He said that his people had sent requests to every major power in the galaxy. The Valari Council had refused to intervene. The Talith Federation had expressed sympathy but offered no ships. The Nor Collective had not even responded. Then the ambassador looked into the camera and said something that changed everything. "We have heard stories about the humans of Earth," he said. "They say you are dangerous. They say you come from a world of death, where everything tries to kill you from the moment you are born. They say you are violent and unpredictable, and that no civilized species should trust you." The ambassador paused. His eyes were wet with tears. "I do not care what they say," he continued. "I have heard other stories too. Stories that say humans will fight for people they have never met. Stories that say you do not abandon those who need help. I do not know if these stories are true. But my people are dying, and you are our last hope. Please. If there is any kindness in your hearts, please help us." The message ended with coordinates and a simple countdown. 14 days until the Vectran finished their work. 14 days until 20 million innocent people ceased to exist. Jake sat in silence for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Admiral Linda Cole. Linda was 60 years old and had commanded ships in 3 different conflicts. She had a reputation for being tough, but fair. When Jake showed her the message, she watched it without expression. But he noticed her jaw tighten when the images of dead children appeared on screen. "The Galactic Council won't help," Jake said. "They're afraid of the Vectran." "And we're not?" Linda asked. "We're human," Jake replied. "We're afraid of lots of things. But we don't let fear stop us from doing what's right." "Jake," Linda nodded slowly. She had spent her career following orders and playing politics. She knew that intervening in this conflict would anger powerful species who wanted Earth to stay quiet and small. She knew it might start a war that humanity could not win. But she also knew that she would not be able to sleep at night if she ignored this message. She called an emergency meeting of the Space Command Council. For 6 hours, generals and admirals argued about strategy and risk and resources. Some said Earth should stay out of it. They said humanity was too new to the galactic stage, too weak, too vulnerable. They said the Korathi were not their problem. Jake listened to all of it. Then he stood up and spoke. 300 years ago, he said, a ship full of refugees tried to cross an ocean to escape people who wanted to kill them. Another country could have helped them. But that country decided it was not their problem. So they turned the ship away. And those refugees were sent back to die. The room was silent. "We are not that country," Jake continued. "We never were, and we never will be. Those people out there are dying because no one is willing to stand up for them. If we turn away now, if we pretend this message never came, then what does that make us? What does it say about humanity? He looked around the room at the men and women who held the fate of two species in their hands. I don't know if we can win this fight, he admitted. But I know we have to try. Because the day we stop caring about innocent people dying is the day we stop being human. Admiral Cole called for a vote. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. Word went out through military channels across the planet. Volunteers were needed for a mission with a high probability of death. The enemy was powerful. The odds were terrible. Anyone who wanted to stay home would not be judged. Within 48 hours, over 10,000 soldiers, pilots, engineers, and medics had stepped forward. They came from every country on Earth. They spoke different languages, and followed different faiths, and had different colored skin. But they all had one thing in common. They refused to let innocent people die alone. The dreadnought Ironclad was humanity's largest warship. It was not pretty. It was not elegant. It was a brutal machine of war, designed to take punishment and keep fighting. Its crew worked around the clock to prepare for the jump to Sethan Prime. On the night before departure, Jake stood on the observation deck and looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, 20 million people were counting the hours until their death. They had sent a message into the void, hoping someone would hear. Someone had. Jake thought about the ambassador's words. The galaxy believed humans were dangerous. They were not wrong, but what they did not understand was that humans were most dangerous when they were protecting someone else. The fleet jumped to hyperspace at exactly midnight. 100 ships carrying 10,000 humans, racing toward a battle they might not survive, to save people they had never met. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you hurt the innocent. The deathworlders were coming. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in a flash of blue light. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the sensors came alive with warnings, and Jake Harris saw what they were facing. 60 Vectran warships hung in orbit around Sethan Prime. They were massive vessels, covered in dark armor and bristling with weapons. Below them, the planet burned. Entire cities had been reduced to craters. Smoke clouds covered half the surface, and even as Jake watched, bright flashes of light marked new bombardment strikes, hitting civilian areas. The Vectran had not expected company. Warlord Sketh commanded the blockade from his flagship, the Crushing Tide. He was 8 feet tall, with a body like an armored insect, and eyes that held no mercy. When his sensors detected the human fleet, he felt only annoyance. His intelligence reports said Earth's military was primitive and weak. These humans were probably here to negotiate, to offer bribes or make threats they could not back up. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Captain Amy Santos sat in the cockpit of her fighter, waiting for the order. She was 34 years old with dark hair cut short and a scar on her chin from a training accident. She had been flying since she was 18 and had never lost a pilot under her command. All squadrons, Jake's voice crackled over the radio. Weapons free. Protect the civilian convoys. Show them what humans are made of. Amy pushed her throttle forward and screamed toward the enemy. The Vectran targeting systems were advanced. They could track objects moving at incredible speeds and predict flight paths with mathematical precision. What they could not do was account for pilots who flew like they did not care about dying. Amy led her squadron through a wall of plasma fire, rolling and spinning in ways that should have been impossible. Human bodies could handle forces that would kill most species. Human reflexes were faster, human instincts sharper, human determination stronger. The Vectran computers kept predicting where the human fighters would be, and the humans kept being somewhere else. The first Vectran ship died 3 minutes into the battle. Amy's squadron concentrated fire on its engines, and the massive vessel broke apart in a bloom of orange flame. The second ship fell moments later. Then the third. On the ground, Lieutenant Danny Vance hit the surface with the first wave of assault troops. The drop pods came down hard, punching through the smoke and debris to land in the ruins of a coastal city. Danny was 28, broad-shouldered, with a face that smiled easily but was not smiling now. The Vectran ground forces were waiting for them. Danny had studied the enemy on the trip over. The Vectran were born soldiers, bred for conquest over thousands of years. Their bodies were covered in natural armor. Their claws could tear through metal. They felt no fear and showed no mercy. Neither did Danny. The first Vectran came at him through the smoke, mandibles clicking, plasma rifle firing. Danny dodged left, rolled under the shot, and came up with his combat knife already swinging. The blade found the gap between the creature's armor plates, and the Vectran went down. More came, many more. Danny's squad fought through streets filled with rubble and bodies, pushing toward a refugee shelter where their sensors showed 3,000 Karathi civilians trapped. The Vectran tried to stop them. The Vectran failed. Back in orbit, Warlord Sketh was beginning to understand his mistake. The human ships did not fight like normal vessels. They did not keep safe distances or follow predictable patterns. They charged straight into his formation, guns blazing, absorbing damage that should have destroyed them. The ironclad took hit after hit, but it would not fall. Its hull was scarred and burning, but its weapons kept firing. "Destroy them," Sketh ordered. "All ships concentrate fire on the human flagship." The Vectran fleet obeyed. Dozens of weapons turned toward the ironclad, pouring enough firepower to melt a moon into its shields. On the bridge, Jake watched the damage reports scroll across his screen. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12. Fire in the engine room. Casualties mounting. Any sensible commander would retreat. Jake was not feeling sensible. "All hands," he announced. "Brace for ramming speed." The ironclad accelerated directly into the heart of the Vectran formation. At the last moment, Jake ordered a hard turn that brought the dreadnought alongside 2 enemy cruisers. The ironclad's broadside guns fired at point-blank range, tearing both ships apart. In the fighter squadrons, Lieutenant Nick Torres took a hit that crippled his craft. His engines were dead. His weapons were offline. He was drifting toward a Vectran carrier that was launching fresh fighters to join the battle. "Nick, eject," Amy ordered. "We'll pick you up." "Negative, Captain." Nick's voice was calm. "My reactor's going critical. I can't stop it, but I can steer." Amy understood. "Nick, don't. Tell my mom I love her," Nick said. Then he cut the channel and pointed his dying fighter at the carrier's hangar bay. The explosion took out 30 Vectran fighters before they could launch. Nick Torres died so that his friends might live. On the surface, Danny's squad finally reached the refugee shelter. The doors were sealed, designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Inside, 3,000 Karathi waited in darkness, listening to the battle raging outside and waiting to die. Danny knocked on the door. It was a stupid thing to do, but he did it anyway. "Hey in there," he called out. "My name is Danny. I'm a human from Earth. We got your message. We're here to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the doors began to open. The Karathi were smaller than Danny had expected. Barely 4 feet tall with silver skin and large dark eyes. They looked at the armored humans with expressions of pure terror. These were the deathworlders, the monsters from the gravity-heavy planet, the species that other races whispered about in fear. Danny pulled off his helmet. His face was covered in sweat and dirt and blood. He was missing a tooth from a fight with a Vectran soldier. He looked exactly like what he was. A dangerous man from a dangerous world. But when he knelt down to meet the eyes of a young Karathi child, his voice was gentle. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now. We're not going to let anyone hurt you." The child did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and touched his face. Then she wrapped her small arms around his neck and held on tight. Above them, the battle raged on. The Vectran fleet was breaking, their formation crumbling under the relentless human assault. Warlord Sketh ordered a retreat, unable to believe what was happening. The humans had done the impossible. They had come from nothing, intervened in a war that was not their concern, and won. But this was only the beginning. As the Vectran ships fled into hyperspace, Jake looked at the burning planet below and knew that the real fight was still coming. The Dominion would not accept this defeat. They would return with more ships, more soldiers, more firepower, and when they did, humanity would be waiting. The news spread across the galaxy like fire. Every species with access to the communication networks watched the footage in stunned silence. A primitive species from a death world had attacked the Vectran Dominion and won. On the Valari Council Station, Counselor Yith sat in his private chambers and watched the battle recordings for the 7th time. The Valari were an ancient species, tall and thin with bioluminescent skin that glowed softly in the dark. They considered themselves the wisest beings in the galaxy. They had dismissed humans as dangerous animals barely worthy of notice. Yith watched a human pilot fly directly into enemy fire to save a refugee transport. He watched human soldiers charge Vectran positions with nothing but rifles and determination. He watched the ironclad absorb enough damage to destroy 3 normal ships and keep fighting anyway. "What are they?" his assistant asked quietly. Yith did not have an answer. On Sethan Prime, the situation was slowly stabilizing. The Vectran bombardment had stopped, but the damage was catastrophic. Entire regions were uninhabitable. Millions were homeless. The dead were still being counted. Medic Kate Porter had not slept in 3 days. She worked in a field hospital that had been set up in a damaged school building. The beds were full. The supplies were running low, and more wounded kept arriving every hour. Kate was 31 years old with red hair and freckles and hands that never shook. Even when she was cutting into alien flesh she had never studied. The Korathi body was different from human anatomy in almost every way. But Kate adapted. She learned. She improvised. A young Korathi child watched her from the corner of the room. The child was maybe 6 years old in human terms, with silver skin and eyes that had seen too much horror. Her parents had died in the bombardment. She had nowhere to go, and no one left. Kate did not know the child's name. She did not speak the language. But whenever she passed by, she made sure to smile and wave, and slowly, day by day, the child began to follow her around the hospital. On the 4th day, the child finally spoke. "Leith," she said, pointing to herself. Kate knelt down and pointed to her own chest. "Kate." Leith tried to say the name. It came out wrong, more like Kate. But Kate did not care. She pulled the child into a hug and held her tight. In that moment, the war felt very far away, but the war was not over. In the depths of Vectran space, Supreme Commander Zorvax received the news of his fleet's defeat with cold fury. Zorvax was the most feared military leader in the Dominion's history. He had conquered 40 worlds and killed millions without hesitation. The idea that a backwater species had humiliated his forces was intolerable. He ordered the largest invasion armada ever assembled. 300 warships, carrying 500,000 soldiers, all pointed at one small planet. He would not just defeat the humans. He would exterminate them. He would burn their ships and slaughter their soldiers and broadcast their deaths across the galaxy as a warning. No one defied the Vectran Dominion and lived. The Human Intelligence Network detected the armada building. Admiral Linda Cole read the reports and felt something cold settle in her stomach. 300 ships against their remaining 80. 500,000 enemy soldiers against their 8,000. The numbers were impossible. She called Jake on a secure channel. "You've seen the reports?" she asked. "Yes, Admiral." "We can't win this," Linda said. "Not conventionally. If we pull back now, consolidate our forces." "The Korathi die," Jake interrupted. "I know." Linda's voice was tired. "I know. But if we stay, our people die too. All of them. And Earth loses its entire fleet." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "Admiral, do you remember why we came here? Because someone asked for help." "That's right. A species we'd never met sent a message into the void, hoping someone would hear. And we heard them. We came. We fought for them, and now they're counting on us to stay." Jake looked out the window of his damaged ship at the planet below. He could see the lights of refugee camps dotting the surface. Millions of people who were alive because humans had chosen to care. "If we leave now," he continued, "what was it all for? What does it say about us? Every species in the galaxy is watching. If we run when things get hard, they'll never trust us. And worse than that, we'll never trust ourselves." Linda closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. She had known from the moment she authorized this mission that there would be no going back. "I'll send out the message," she said quietly. The transmission went to every human ship, station, and colony in the sector. Linda's face appeared on screens across the fleet. Calm and resolute. "This is Admiral Cole. In approximately 48 hours, a Vectran armada of 300 ships will arrive at Sethan Prime. They're coming to finish what they started. They're coming to kill every human and every Korathi on this planet." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not going to lie to you. The odds are bad. Really bad. Some of us won't make it home. Maybe none of us will. If anyone wants to leave, I won't stop you. I won't blame you. You've already done more than anyone could ask." The Admiral straightened in her chair. "But I'm staying. These people need us. And I believe that when you signed up for this mission, you knew it might come to this. You knew the risks. And you came anyway. Because that's who we are. That's what it means to be human." She smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "So if you're with me, get ready. We've got a fight coming. And we're going to show the galaxy what deathworlders can do when they're protecting something they love." She cut the transmission and waited. Across the fleet, men and women looked at each other. They thought about home. They thought about family. They thought about all the reasons they should leave. Not a single ship powered up its engines. 48 hours later, the first Vectran ships appeared on the sensors. Then more. Then more. 300 vessels dropped out of hyperspace, blotting out the stars. Jake stood on the bridge of the ironclad and looked at the wall of enemy ships. His hands were steady. His heart was calm. Behind him, his crew waited in silence. "All hands," he said quietly. "Battle stations." The final battle for Sethan Prime had begun. The sky above Sethan Prime turned into hell. 300 Vectran warships opened fire at once. The darkness of space lit up with plasma bolts and missile trails, and the bright flashes of exploding vessels. Human ships flew into the storm without hesitation, their guns blazing, their pilots screaming war cries that echoed across the communication channels. Amy Santos led her fighter squadron into the heart of the enemy formation. She had started this battle with 36 pilots. Within the first hour, she had 18 left. "Stay tight," she ordered through gritted teeth. "Target their weapons arrays. Make every shot count." Around her, human fighters danced through walls of enemy fire. They moved in ways that Vectran targeting computers could not predict, diving and rolling and spinning at speeds that would have killed any other species. The Gi forces pressed down on them like the hand of a giant, crushing the breath from their lungs, but they kept flying. Lieutenant Nick Torres was gone. Amy had watched him die. But she could not grieve now. Grief was for later. Now there was only the fight. On the ground, Danny Vance and his soldiers held the last defensive line in front of the civilian shelters. The Vectran had landed troops by the thousands. Huge armored warriors, who felt no pain and knew no mercy. They came in wave after wave, claws clicking, weapons firing. Danny was wounded. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his left arm, and he could barely feel his fingers. But he kept fighting. When his rifle ran dry, he picked up a fallen enemy's weapon. When that broke, he used his combat knife. When the knife got stuck in a Vectran's armor, he used his fists. Behind him, Korathi volunteers stood with human soldiers, fighting for their own planet for the first time. They were not warriors. They were farmers and teachers and artists who had never held a weapon before this week. But they had learned, and they were not giving up. A Vectran assault wave pushed through a gap in the line, heading straight for a shelter full of children. Danny saw it happening. He was too far away. Too slow. Too late. He ran anyway. The Vectran soldier was 8 feet tall and weighed 500 pounds. Danny was 6 feet and 200. It did not matter. He hit the creature at full speed, knocking it off balance. And then they were rolling through the mud together, clawing and punching and biting. Danny ended up on top. His knife was gone. His rifle was gone. He had nothing but his hands and his rage and his absolute refusal to let this monster hurt those children. He grabbed the Vectron's head and twisted. The armor plating groaned and cracked. The creature thrashed beneath him, trying to throw him off. But Danny held on. He twisted harder. Something broke. The Vectran stopped moving. Danny stood up, swaying on his feet, covered in blood that was both his and his enemy's. The other Vectran soldiers had stopped advancing. They were staring at him. For the first time in their history, the Vectran were afraid. In orbit, the ironclad was dying. Fire raged through half the ship. Life support was failing on multiple decks. The hull was more whole than metal in some sections. But the guns were still firing. Chief Engineer Pete Garza worked in the engine room, surrounded by smoke and sparks and the screaming of damaged machinery. He was 53 years old and had been fixing ships since before Jake was born. He knew every bolt and wire of the ironclad like he knew his own children. A power conduit had blown. Without it, the main guns would go offline in minutes. The repair required someone to go into a compartment flooded with radiation and heat that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. Pete looked at the compartment. Then he started putting on his suit. "Chief, that's suicide," his assistant said. "Maybe." Pete sealed his helmet. "But those guns need to keep firing. Our people are counting on us." He walked into the compartment and got to work. The repair took 4 minutes. By the time Pete finished, his suit was melting and his skin was burned, and his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. But the connection was made. The guns kept firing. Pete stumbled out of the compartment and collapsed. His assistant dragged him to safety, screaming for a medic. Pete's eyes were closed, but he was smiling. The ironclad kept fighting. Supreme Commander Zorvax watched the battle from his flagship with growing disbelief. His forces outnumbered the humans 4-1. His ships were bigger, stronger, better armed. By every calculation, this should have been over hours ago. But the humans would not die. Every time he destroyed one of their ships, the others fought harder. Every time he killed one of their soldiers, 10 more seemed to take their place. They were using tactics that made no sense. Sacrificing themselves to protect damaged vessels. Ramming their fighters into his cruisers. Fighting with a fury that his species had never encountered. What were these creatures? Then the sensors detected new contacts. Zorvax looked at the readings and felt something he had not experienced in decades. Surprise. Ships were emerging from hyperspace. Not human ships. Valari cruisers. Talith destroyers. Even 2 massive Nor battle platforms, vessels from a species that had not engaged in combat for 3 centuries. The galaxy was watching, and the galaxy had made a choice. Counselor Yith stood on the bridge of his ship, watching the human fleet fight. He had spent his entire life believing that violence was primitive, that war was the tool of lesser species, but watching these humans sacrifice themselves for strangers, watching them stand against impossible odds because it was right, he understood something new. Sometimes, courage was its own kind of wisdom. "All ships," he ordered, "engage the Vectran fleet. Support the human position." The combined fleet caught Zorvax's armada in a crossfire. Vectran ships began exploding across the battlefield. The formation that had seemed invincible minutes ago was crumbling. Zorvax screamed orders, trying to rally his forces, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted. His soldiers were retreating. His captains were requesting permission to withdraw. In a final act of spite, Zorvax ordered his flagship to charge directly at the ironclad. If he was going to lose, he would take the human commander with him. Amy saw it coming. Her squadron was down to 8 fighters, all of them damaged, all of them low on ammunition. But the crushing tide was heading straight for Jake's ship, and she was the only thing in its path. "All pilots," she said, "form up on me." One last run, 8 fighters flew into the path of a battleship. They fired everything they had, pouring their remaining weapons into the massive vessel's engines. It was not enough to destroy it, but it was enough to slow it down, enough to throw off its aim, enough to give the ironclad time to move. The crushing tide's main gun fired. It missed. A second later, the ironclad's broadside tore through the Vectran flagship. Zorvax had just enough time to realize he had lost before his ship exploded around him. The battle was over. Danny Vance looked up at the sky as the last Vectran ships fled into hyperspace. The clouds were clearing for the first time in weeks. Sunlight touched his face, warm and golden. Around him, Korathi survivors emerged from their shelters. They looked at the humans who had saved them with expressions that needed no translation. Danny sat down in the mud, too tired to stand. A small Korathi child walked up to him and pressed something into his hand. It was a flower, somehow still alive amid all the destruction. Danny looked at the flower. Then he looked at the child. And for the first time in days, he smiled. They had won. The silence after battle was the hardest part. Jake Harris stood in the medical bay of the Ironclad, looking at rows of wounded soldiers. The ship was barely holding together. Hull breaches had been sealed with emergency patches. Fires had been put out with whatever was available. The engines were running at 30%, just enough to maintain orbit. They had won. But the cost was staggering. Over 4,000 human soldiers had died in the battle. 23 ships had been destroyed. Countless others were damaged beyond repair. The names of the dead were still being compiled. A list that grew longer with every passing hour. Jake stopped beside a bed where Pete Garza lay wrapped in bandages. The chief engineer had lost his left arm to radiation burns. His face was scarred. His voice was weak, but his eyes were still bright. "Hey, Commander," Pete croaked. "We win?" Jake nodded. "We won, Chief. Thanks to you." Pete tried to shrug and winced at the pain. "Just doing my job. Besides, I'm right-handed anyway. Doc says they can fit me with a prosthetic in a few weeks. I'll be back in that engine room before you know it." Jake smiled despite himself. Humans were stubborn creatures. It was their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. "Get some rest," he said. "That's an order." "Yes, sir." Pete's eyes were already closing. Hell of a fight, though. Hell of a fight. On the surface of Sethan Prime, Kate Porter was finally taking a break. She sat on a pile of rubble outside the field hospital, watching the sun set over a scarred landscape. The sky was orange and purple and beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel after so much death. Leith sat beside her, the young Korathi girl who had become her shadow. Over the past weeks, they had developed their own language, a mixture of words and gestures that let them communicate despite the barrier between their species. "Kate tired," Leith said, pointing at Kate's face. Kate laughed. "Yes. Kate very tired. Bad things over now?" Kate looked at the sky, at the stars beginning to appear as night fell. Somewhere up there, the remains of the Vectran Armada were fleeing back to their space. The war was not truly over. There would be negotiations and treaties, and probably more fighting before everything was settled. But for now, at least, the killing had stopped. "Yes," she said. "Bad things over now." Leith leaned against her, and Kate put her arm around the child's thin shoulders. They sat together in silence. Two beings from different worlds, watching the stars come out. The Galactic Council convened 1 month after the battle. Representatives from every major species gathered in the Great Chamber, a space that had witnessed 10,000 years of history. But nothing like this had ever happened before. Ambassador Diane Park stood before the assembled delegates. She was 45 years old, with gray-streaked hair and a calm presence that made people listen when she spoke. She had spent her career in diplomacy, navigating the complex politics of a galaxy that had largely ignored her species. That time was over. "The Vectran Dominion committed crimes against the Korathi people," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. "They attacked without provocation. They killed millions of civilians. And when the Korathi asked for help, this council refused." The delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "My people came to help because it was right, not because we expected anything in return. Not because we wanted power or territory or resources. We came because innocent people were dying and someone needed to stand up for them." Diane looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each delegate in turn. "I know what you think of us. You think we're dangerous, unpredictable. You think we're monsters from a deathworld who should be kept at a distance. And maybe some of that is true. We are dangerous. Our planet shaped us to survive in conditions that would kill most species. But that same world also taught us something else. It taught us that survival means nothing if we don't protect each other. She placed her hands on the podium, steady and sure. Humans don't leave people behind. We don't ignore cries for help. And we don't stand by while innocents suffer. If that makes us dangerous, then so be it. We would rather be dangerous and kind than safe and cruel. The chamber was silent. Then, slowly, Counselor Yith rose from his seat. The Valari elder walked to the center of the room and stood facing Diane. I have watched your species since you first reached the stars, he said. I thought I understood what you were. I was wrong. He bowed his glowing head, a gesture of deep respect in Valari culture. On behalf of my people, I offer thanks, and I ask for forgiveness. Other delegates began to rise. The Talith representative, the Nor ambassador. One by one, species that had once dismissed humanity as primitive offered their acknowledgement. The Vectran Dominion was sanctioned and forced to pay reparations. Their military was restricted to defensive forces only. It was not perfect justice for the millions who had died, but it was a start. 6 months later, a memorial was completed on Sethan Prime. It stood in a plaza in the capital city, a city that had been half destroyed and was now being rebuilt with help from a dozen worlds. Human engineers worked beside Korathi builders. Valari architects designed alongside Talith craftsmen. The statue at the center of the plaza showed a human soldier and a Korathi civilian, their hands clasped together. The human was kneeling to meet the shorter alien's eyes. The Korathi was looking up with an expression of hope. The inscription at the base was written in both languages. They heard our cry. They came. They stayed. Jake stood before the statue on the day of its dedication. He wore his dress uniform, the same one he had worn when the mission began. It felt tighter now. The past months had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. Amy Santos walked up beside him. Her arm was in a sling from injuries she had taken in the final battle. She had refused a medical discharge, insisting she would fly again as soon as she healed. Think the galaxy's ready for us? She asked. Jake watched a group of children playing in the plaza's shadow. Korathi and human kids, running and laughing together, speaking a mixed language they had invented themselves. One of them was Leith, the orphan who had attached herself to Kate Porter. Leith waved at him with a bright smile. Jake waved back. Probably not, he said. But they'll learn. Behind them, the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of gold and amber. The first stars were appearing, points of light in an infinite darkness. Somewhere out there, other species were watching. Other worlds were learning about what had happened here. Other beings were wondering what kind of creatures had come from Earth. They were called deathworlders. They came from a planet that tried to kill them from the moment they were born. They were strong and fierce and dangerous in ways that frightened other species, but they were also kind. They answered calls for help. They protected those who could not protect themselves. And they never, ever gave up. The galaxy had wanted to know what humans were. Now they knew, and they would never forget.